Hello, everyone, and welcome to BIPAC's Advocacy and Action series, where we break down the strategies and best practices that help organizations build effective and impactful political affairs programs. I'm your host, Liz Bird, and today I'm so excited to be joined by Jessica Hamilton at Airbus. Jessica, before we dive in, I'll let you introduce yourself and tell our listeners a little bit about your background and the work that you do.
Thanks, Liz. I'm thrilled to be with you guys today to give our listeners some context. I've spent the last 20 years navigating the world of government relations and communications. And in that time, I've carved out a niche for myself by sitting right at the intersection of these two disciplines. I've come to realize that while policy expertise really is the foundation, psychology is the actual driver of effective advocacy. And I'm really thrilled to share that with you guys today.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I got a sneak peek at her talking points, and all I have to say is I'm really excited this is being recorded because I don't want to forget a single thing that she shares with us. And today's episode is titled How Clear Communication Drives Influence. So we're going to be talking about things that, like, what separates good government affairs messaging from great messaging, how to simplify these complex policy issues without losing your credibility, and why clarity, storytelling, and audience first thinking is so critical to effective programs in the long run. Jessica, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that, but if not, we can just jump right in with our first question.
Let's do it.
All right, so let's start big picture. In your view, what separates good messaging from great messaging, especially when the goal is to influence your stakeholders?
Well, I think in the introduction, you hit the nail right on the head. Over the course of my career, I've seen firsthand that influence isn't driven by volume or access alone. It is also driven by clarity. And whether I'm advising executives, engaging policymakers or mobilizing employees, my work focuses on translating complex policy and business priorities into messages that resonate and move decision makers to act. And that is a perspective that I want to talk a little bit more about today as we discuss and explore how clear communication strengthens advocacy and delivers real results. Now, to help us get there, I've framed our conversation around a couple of core pillars that I use to bridge the gap between good and great messaging. And when you're ready, I'd be happy to dive into that.
I'm so ready.
Okay, well, let's start here. And you can feel free to ask questions as we
Yeah,
go along, or whatever works best for you guys. So,
yeah.
pillar number one, the psychology of friction. How can we bypass cognitive load for both legislators and the C-suite? Pillar two, the cultural translator. Why stripping away jargon actually increases your credibility as a trusted advisor. Three, empathy mapping. Moving from that egocentric messaging to addressing the specific currencies of your audience.
Mhm.
Uh, Four, the Trojan horse of storytelling. Everybody loves a good victim story, and using that victim effect to make that data stick is very important and makes your story more relevant. Uh, I believe the next one is tonal agility, how linguistic mirroring builds rapport in both the hallway of Congress and the boardroom, also. And a little fun trick I have picked up recently is the zombie rule. And this is a simple editing trick to ensure that every piece of communication, whether it be internal or external, actually moves the needle. So I'm looking forward to diving into these and showing how a couple of shifts in communication can lead to this massive increase in communication and, influence.
Yeah, so I guess your pillar two, um, many campaigns that government relations professionals are sending out have that policy jargon and all those acronyms, and it's alphabet soup. So I guess how would you recommend that these communicators simplify complex issues without losing that credibility or substance?
So it's so funny. I think so many people, professionals, use that jargon as a security blanket, fearing that simplicity lacks authority. But in reality, I think a lot of influential GR pros really should be acting as a cultural translator. So externally, we use, that bridge and, comparing a complex regulation to a common experience, like upgrading your phone's operating system, for instance. Internally, we really need to be taking away that beltway speak that alienates colleagues in, legal or product or, manufacturing. You don't lose credibility when you simplify, you gain it by providing a way to understand an issue deeply enough to make it accessible to the people that you're communicating with.
Yeah, I love that. If the goal is to try to build trust and that influence with these people, we do have to make them feel included. You can make people feel the opposite when it's like, well, what does GOTV mean? I don't understand. Like PAC,
Correct.
PAC, like it's just those simple switches, I think, make such
Hmm.
a difference. And that's such an important point. I guess let's talk about audience and expand more on your empathy mapping point. In your experience, how do you think government affairs professionals can ensure their copy centers the audience? And if you want to expand more on your pillar.
Oh boy. Okay. So I think it's so important that we move away from egocentric messaging.
Mhm.
So, what we want to
Yeah.
empathy centric messaging, which is what your audience needs. Externally, we use empathy mapping to solve our stakeholders' problem, whether it's a re-election concern, a local economic dip, using policy or whatever it is as the solution. Internally, that means recognizing that different departments have different currencies. Your CFO will care about risk. Your communications and PR team, they're going to care about reputation and your brand. When you speak their specific language, you transition from being a cost center to a strategic partner.
I like that. And I love that you're starting with the audience focus. Even though that kind of sounds obvious, it's something that we can forget when we're so focused on our priorities. But the moment you shift to speaking about their priorities, their challenges, the things that impact their job and what they care about, that's when your message really starts to resonate. Small change, but
Correct.
big
And that's
difference.
where it's going to land, right? I mean, you
Yeah.
don't tell them what you want to tell them. You tell them what you want
Yeah.
to tell them in a way that they're ready to hear it and receive it.
Yes,
Meet
I
them
listened
where
to a
they are.
webinar and it was like we use so much I, we, us, but the second you start using you, well, this matters to you. That one stuck with me. So I like how you
You
framed it.
are exactly right. And you know what I noticed when we used words like our and,
Mhm.
whatever that looks like. Words like Airbus in the company, people had a strong attachment to that name and that brand. But when you talked about, we and our, people felt like it was like a corporate versus us, kind of approach, especially within, our locations that are not located where our corporate headquarters were. And so once I kind of figured that out, it was a really interesting adjustment of how we communicated with our people. And you will find in most of my internal communications, I replace our, for instance, with the word Airbus. And maybe that would work for others as they are, trying to communicate internally with their employees also.
So, Jessica, I want you to tell me more about the Trojan horse of storytelling. What role does this play in your messaging?
Storytelling is the Trojan horse for data. So, psychology is going to tell us that the identifiable victim effect, people are moved by the struggle of an individual more than the statistics of 1,000. So, externally, a story about one small business owner that's impacted by, for instance, a tax code change is going to be far more memorable than a 20-page white paper, right? Internally, uh, don't just report that you monitored 50 bills. Tell the story about how one hallway conversation prevented some sort of regulatory disaster. Storytelling really makes the intangible work of government relations feel more concrete and essential.
Yeah. And I think sometimes the best stories are simple and repeatable. You don't need 10 stories. You need one good story that can be easily remembered and easily retold. And that's what gets it sticky. And that's what gets people repeating it and sharing it too.
I
So,
love that you said stickiness because that was definitely something that I was thinking as this,
Mhm.
you need your elevator pitch, you need your sound bites, you need something that sticks. And
Yes.
the simpler it is, that, the easier that you can distill it into something that's simple, you'll be able to repeat it and repeat it and repeat it. And at some point, maybe it becomes an urban legend because you've repeated it for so much.
I love that. So I guess I know tone can be tricky, especially when we're speaking to all these different audiences that we've been talking to internally. So how are you striking the right tone for these different audiences?
Oh boy. I do think, as you said, like the
Mhm.
influence comes down to this mirroring ability. So externally, I did a tonal audit of our targets. If they're formal, let's be formal. If they're disruptive, let's match that energy to build, subconscious rapport. Internally, I have been trying to practice this tonal agility, right? So we speak the language of risk aversion with,
Mhm.
legal, and the language and of opportunity with sales. By shifting your tone to match the room, you ensure that you're not just a voice in the meeting, but a trusted advisor who understands everyone's mission. And ultimately, what this comes down to, reading the room, reading
Yeah.
the room, and match that energy, match that language. I have
Mhm.
heard of a couple of organizations. They were trying to communicate their messages to, the new administration and the new Congress. And what they did is they tried to pick out a couple of key phrases or things that just happened to be reported a lot. Maybe they did a word mapping. I can't
Yeah.
remember the exercise um, specifically, but then they tried to repackage whatever communication product that they were trying to put out there and insert, some of the adjectives that they would take out some of the adjectives that they would normally use and insert some of the adjectives du jour,
Mhm.
which could be really fun if you were, for instance, trying to speak with the new administration
Mhm.
and trying to get their attention. You're literally speaking their language.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's a really good tip. And I think one thing that stands out to me, kind of from what you've said and just like in my experience, is consistency. I feel like I can't say it enough, but great messages, like we've talked about, they're not one-off. Even when you're changing the word choices, it's still that same clear theme over and over again across multiple channels, in person, digital. And that when people are hearing that same story, like we said, that's what gets it sticky. So keeping it consistent, that's what's turning it into trust and then turning it
And
into
then
influence.
exactly. And I feel like in communications, from a advertising, marketing, branding perspective, I feel like if somebody says, gosh, I'm getting sick of that, that means that your message is just starting to land, and don't
Yes.
let your foot off the gas.
Full force, pedal to the metal.
Correct.
So I guess if you could give one editing rule to government relations pros to make their writing stronger and more actionable, what would you say?
I think to revolutionize your writing, eliminate the passive voice. So I read this recently and I thought that this was very interesting. Use the zombie test. So
Yeah.
if you can add by zombies after a verb, like the bill was blocked by zombies, your writing is passive and weak. So active verbs assign accountability, they drive action. From an internal perspective, I really am a big fan of the so what test. So every paragraph should answer that question immediately. So if a busy executive can't see the impact in the first two sentences, strike them out. Active, impact focused writing is what is going to move the needle.
I love that. That's such practical advice. I can't believe I've never heard that rule. And it's honestly applicable way beyond government relations. Everyone needs to be
Absolutely.
using that in their writing. I also think something basic, like you've kind of said, that I recently got reminded of on like a webinar or something I read is read your stuff out loud or ask someone who isn't in the space, like, what does this sound like to you? Because we just get so head down that it's like shifting your perspective and just like checking in with someone else or reading it out loud. Like, you really realize like, oh, I need to change a couple of words to make this fit.
Correct. And I have definitely been a victim of that myself, where I wrote something down and it didn't
Mhm.
sound out loud. It didn't
Yes.
land the way that I had intended. And that has been unfortunately to my detriment. So learn from my mistakes right there. But what's interesting, the emergence of AI, I also think is really challenging,
Yes.
changing, I should say, so much of how we communicate.
Mhm.
And in fact, I read a book. I was in a book club by and a former Obama speechwriter. It's called "Say It Well" by Terry Zuplat. So, book plug on that.
Yeah.
Um, I really found like some of the communications techniques, like whether it be like, plugging in some of your things to an AI platform and say, this is what I would like to say. How would it be received by a blue collar audience? How would it be received by, fill in the blank, and as descriptive as you could possibly make it, I think
Yeah.
has been very, very interesting to help point out the flaws, the holes, the perception things that I
Mhm.
would not have necessarily thought about. I haven't used that part of the tool very
Uh-huh.
often. But when it comes to GOTV, when it comes to pack communications, when it comes to, some of these things, I have tried it out a little bit. And I think that it's been, kind of interesting. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. But it has allowed for additional conversation or consideration that I didn't think about, or even as you mentioned, when you talk about it with a friend, like sometimes we are our own echo chambers. And so,
Yes.
having this, think outside the box mentality has been really interesting. So, plugging in, that to your AI tool
Mhm.
would probably be interesting. And then also going back to what we were talking about with your tone in linguistic mirroring. I mean, it might
Oh,
also be really interesting to take what you're trying to say and ask
yeah.
it to say, in a way that X audience would, hear it or be more receptive to it. I bet you can get some really fun answers that way.
I bet you could too. And I think something important to highlight with what you've been talking about is you use AI for like brainstorming and like repurposing, but you're never like exporting your thought leadership. And I also think something that you made me think of that I recently had a conversation with someone about is like once you really understand how to use a good prompt, you can like get a lot more out of using like the AI tools and everything. So really like nailing down your prompt would be like a good tip to really get you that end product that you want when you're trying to do
Agreed.
these things too. Because no one
Agreed.
really teaches you how to search something on a search engine or how to write a good prompt on these things. It's something you kind of got to trial and error, but once you get it, it really makes a big difference.
Right. And, again, we were talking about how are you communicating to for instance, your C-suite audience. And
Yeah.
so, when you want something to be proofread, for instance, you can put in your prompt, this is intended for a C-suite audience, make sure that it has, the impact that we're desiring and maybe has like a must read factor.
Mhm.
And so that could be very helpful and, a helpful tool in making sure that your messages land with those types of audiences also.
Yeah, I love that. Jessica, I have so many great notes. I don't know about you. I don't know if you have anything else you want to add or leave our listeners with. But if not, it's been great to chat with you, and I feel like that can wrap up our episode.
Thank you guys so much for the opportunity. Really glad to share some tips and tricks along the way. And, I'd be very curious for our listeners if you have tips and tricks, send them
Yes.
to us so that we can, better ourselves and our little community. But thank you, Liz, for another great episode of Advocacy in Action.
Yes, these are my favorite conversations to have. And if you did like this episode, be sure to subscribe, share with your network. We have a library of other episodes, and you can even consider sponsoring us for more conversations like this one. Thank you.